Well, there are several warnings in the book of Hebrews. Several warnings. Lots of encouragement, but several warnings. And the first one is contained here. And in this verse 1, it says, "We must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away." So that we do not drift away. And there are several things through this chapter that we're tempted to do. We're tempted to do as Christians, and particularly these people were. And the answer for each one is, but we see King Jesus. But we see King Jesus. It's to do with our view being correct of who Jesus is. That's so important. If I'm guessing every single time we sin, it's because we don't have a right view of Jesus. What we first have to understand as well is the humility of the writer. We don't know who the author is of the Hebrews, of the book of Hebrews, but they are humble. Why do I say that? Because it says, we must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. He's not saying he's rock solid, that he won't ever turn his back on the Lord Jesus. He's saying we must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. We're tempted to drift, but we need to see King Jesus. You've probably heard of the hymn, we sang it a few weeks ago, "Come, thou fount of every blessing." We sang it to the newish tune. It's obviously an old hymn, and written by a fellow called Robert Robinson. And he was a pastor, and sadly, he drifted, even as he did his work, and even though he was still preaching, he drifted spiritually. And he actually went travelling. He went off travelling. And on one of his times away, he was on a train, and he bumped into a keen young Christian woman. And she said at one point in their conversation, "I found this hymn. What do you think of it? What do you think of it? What's your view of this hymn?" And guess what? It was the very hymn that he'd written, "Come thou fount of every blessing." And he had to admit that actually he'd done the very thing. You know, in those verses it talks about prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the Lord I love. And he'd done that very thing. And he was called back because the Lord obviously had that lady there on that journey in his grace. So Robert Robinson was brought back to the faith. He drifted away, but he was brought back. So we're tempted to drift, but we see, and we need to see, King Jesus. It says there, "For if the message spoken by angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation?" Now, that's quite wordy, isn't it? And it's kind of, how do I get my head around it? I'm going to put it like this. We're tempted to disregard Christ's work, and they are particularly, but we need to see who King Jesus is. Now, it says here, the message spoken by angels. What's that? That sounds a bit spooky, doesn't it? That's simply the bringing of the law. Mount Sinai, 10 Commandments, and all that the children of God had to obey. Now that was binding. In other words, that was the law. It wasn't, you can obey it if you don't want to. You know, they tell you to do 30 miles an hour, but I can go 40 because no one's watching. There's no Gatso speed camera. It's not that sort of thing. We know that God is always watching, and he put that law there for their good. It's binding. And then it says every violation and disobedience. And you might think, Well, that's two ways of saying the same thing. It's not actually. Technically, so a violation is the sins of commission. When you say, I'm jolly well going to do what I want, and I know it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah? Sins of commission, when you plan to do what you know to be wrong. That's the violation. And then disobedience. They're sins of omission. When you know the good thing you should be doing, and you don't do it. You turn your back on it, and you say, no, I'm too lazy, can't be bothered, whatever. Again, it's a form of wrong. It's disobedience. So sins of commission, sins of omission. When you do what is wrong or when you don't do what is right. And it says that every violation and disobedience received its just punishment. In other words, you didn't get away with it. How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? In other words, if that was the Old Testament, and that was inferior to what we have now, how much more should we be obeying what is now presented to us? How can we ignore such a great salvation? And how shall we escape? These Hebrews thought the old covenant was more important than the new. But no, the new covenant is actually superior. Angels delivered the first message. The Lord himself delivered the new message, which is the fulfillment of the first. It is much more important. The first message given by angels was binding. How much more judgment we receive if we ignore all that Christ has done. It says there in verse 4, so I'm hopping over some of verse 3. This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord. So in other words, it's Jesus himself who's doing it this time round, not the angels, was confirmed to us by those who heard him, the apostles. Yeah. And that is confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. You see, lots of people will say, God, show us who you are, do an amazing miracle now. God might do miracles now, but it's not so important that he does miracles now. He has his word of testimony here. We have his word of testimony here, the Bible. And this should be sufficient for us. You see, in those early days, they didn't have the New Testament scriptures, did they? All they had was the Old Testament to go on, and then the accounts, people saying, I've seen Jesus, I've heard Jesus, he did this. And eventually, of course, we have the Gospels and these letters, but not at that particular point in time when this was written. God testified to it by signs and wonders and various miracles, because they had to have that to confirm the truth of what they'd have. Now we have the testimony of both Old and New Testaments all coming together, saying this is true. This is what we need. This is the salvation, the togetherness of it all. It holds together. We simply need to put our faith into this gospel, into this message of salvation. And that should be enough for us. And when we take it in his word, he does the miracle of making us new people, which some say, and many say, that is the greatest miracle of all. Rather than somebody being healed of their bad back or whatever it might be. But for somebody to turn from being against God to being a person who loves God, that is the greatest miracle of all. He takes a corrupt heart that's against him, and instead he is, or she is, a person who loves God and wants to love and serve him always. Verse 5 says this: It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. So there, in the Hebrews that this is written to, they're tempted to elevate the angels, but we must see, and they must see, our need for King Jesus. Again, they're thinking of angels as being superior to Jesus. And it's interesting here, in verse 6, it says there's a place where someone has testified. Now you might think, he's a bit vague, isn't he? We know that's Psalm 8. But of course there was no Psalm 8 at the time. They didn't have numbers. They were only numbered a few hundred years ago. Okay, and the same thing with the verses. They didn't have those, so it was just in the Psalms. It was obviously they might have known those verses, they might have known those words, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was. That's why it says there's a place where someone has testified. What is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man, that you care for him. You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honour and put everything under his feet. Now we might think, well, are we crowned with glory and honour? Well, we sometimes feel very blessed by God. But put everything under his feet. We don't see that now, do we? We don't have real dominion over the world in the way that Adam did when Adam was first made, before the fall of man. In putting everything under him, he goes on, God left nothing that is not subject to him. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to him. But we see Jesus. This is where our key phrase comes from in verse 9. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honour, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So we're tempted to downgrade Jesus' status, but we must see King Jesus as he really is. In bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. Now when it says perfect, Jesus was perfect already. Now the word perfect, as you read your Bible, sometimes the word perfect you've got to replace with the word complete. So Jesus had to go through this in his experience. Although as God he was perfect, he needed to become human, so that in being human he knew what it was that we are going to go through. And we're going to have more of that later. But he had to become like this, he had to become like us to be our sin bearer. He had to become human. As it says in verse 10, in bringing many sons to glory. Bringing many sons to glory. That's talking about, when it says sons, you might think, I'm a daughter. What about me? Well, when it says sons, it's because a son is the one who had all the honour. Only very recently in royalty has the succession of the crown now going to women. Doesn't matter where they're born in the order of things. So if you're the firstborn and a woman in the royal family, you would have waited, as it were, until you had a brother, and then it would pop over you as the woman, and you wouldn't be in line for the throne until it had gone through all your brothers, and then to you. I bet it's something like that. But now it's not like that. In Jewish time, it's just like that. No, it's everyone is seen as a son, because if you're a woman, then you're treated like a son. Yeah, in other words, you're getting the best. It's not that you're second class at all. Actually, you're elevated to the class of a son in Jewish culture. Yeah? So it's a good thing. So they don't read that sexism or anything like that. This is a good thing. This is a good thing. Yeah? So in bringing many sons to glory, it was, in other words, taking all those people who are trusting in him and elevating them to the level of Jesus, where Jesus is now. So we look ahead to that time when we too will be glorified, not just Jesus, not us looking up and thinking, yes, Jesus is in the highest place now, but saying eventually we will be there. So he's speaking in past tense, if you like, or certainly in present tense, even though he's talking about a future event. In bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect or complete through suffering. Both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. And this is mind-blowing as well. So this is saying that Jesus, even though he's God, and us, because we are in his blood-bought family, we are of the same family, because we are the ones that he has paid for our salvation. We have been made holy through his blood. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. Again, women folk, don't feel left out. This is, again, it's about honour. Yeah. And he says, I will declare your name to my brothers. In the presence of the congregation, I will sing your praises. It's quoting from Psalm 22, verse 22. And again, I will put my trust in him. Again, he says, here am I, and the children God has given me. So now the analogy changes a bit, because it goes from being we're Jesus' brother to being Jesus' children, as it were. Here am I, and the children God has given me. We were thinking recently in Isaiah 53, verse 10, where it says, it talks about the children. I'm just going to turn it up. Yes, it was the Lord's will. Yes, it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And we are his offspring, aren't we? It's amazing. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity. We're flesh and blood, aren't we? We know that when we cut ourselves. We know that we have aches and pains, don't we? We know how human we are. We see the baby photos, from before we had a decent memory. And it reminds us of the time where we were perhaps even frailer than we are now. And we go through and grow up. Since the children have flesh and blood, we're human, in other words. He too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. Gets clear about that one. And free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. We're tempted to fear death, aren't we? But we must see King Jesus. Fear of aging and fear of death is everywhere around us. We were talking this morning about people getting so hung up on their looks, on getting different things done to their teeth or face and hair, and just continually trying to present a perfect or the most perfect impression upon people. And fear of death, I believe, is everywhere amongst our Western society. And yet, I'm going to turn this up. This is from a letter, an email I received from, if I can get to it. No, it's not playing ball. There we go. Don't worry. I went to stay with some people because I was working for London City Mission some years ago, back in 2003, and I stayed with them a number of times during a week or a weekend. And they were some of the loveliest people I've ever met on this earth, wonderful hosts. And he was a retired minister who still busied himself doing a lot of preaching. And she had been the daughter of a London City missionary who had actually ministered way back during the Second World War and beyond. And they were just the loveliest people. And I'd lost contact with them. And all I had was a memory of their address, their street address. So, and I hadn't seen them probably since, 2013 or something like that. And I wrote a letter, and because the husband was older, I thought, he must be quite old now. I thought he must be 89 or 90. And I thought, he might have died. I thought, I won't put too much in this letter, but I wrote it to the woman, to the wife. So I wrote it off, June Cox, wrote the address, sent it off to Cheltenham, and I sent my details, my email and whatever, in the letter. And a couple of days later, I got an email, and it was addressed June in Glory. So it's Jeff and June, that was her name. It said June in Glory. And it was saying, thanks for your letter. But June didn't receive it because she went to be with the Lord 3 months ago. So this is this January that I received the letter. She died last October, and apparently in July she'd got the news that she had liver cancer, and it was terminal. It was inoperable. But they were amazed at the hospital, at the attitude of Jeff and June, and how they just reacted to the news with complete peace, and there was no fear of death at all. And several people had noted this as well. Some people had actually commented on in the hospital staff who'd said, I can't believe your attitude and the way you're just calmly taking all this. And they said, just go out and enjoy yourselves. And I wrote back to Jeff and I said, that really amuses me. I said, because you're two people who always enjoyed yourselves anyway. Whatever you're doing, you seem to enjoy it. Whether it was giving hospitality, whether it was preaching, whatever it was. Every task in life seemed to be done with so much enjoyment. And yet, even when it came to that news of her ending life on this earth and going to be with the Lord, they weren't fazed at all. And I think, what a wonderful testimony to the power of God to equip a life with that sense of peace and security, to take us from this existence into the next world. And that's why I'm saying, we can be tempted to fear death, but we must see King Jesus in his glory. Yes, he came as a human. He came because he had to become human to save us in that way, on the cross, becoming sin for us. In verse 16, I've got the last 3 verses here. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. Angels don't need help. They're human. They're not human. They're sinless. They're nothing like human. They're sinless. And for this reason, he had to be made, as Jesus had to be made like his brothers in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. He might pay for our sins. If we do something wrong, we know we have to be punished. And that's the law. We all feel it, don't we? We all feel it. We said that recently. When we hear about somebody who does something horrible and we say, lock him up. And that's a feeling of justice. But when it comes to ourselves, we don't want to be punished, do we? We want to be let off. But Jesus is our merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. He became our atonement. He paid for our sin. And because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. We're tempted to think that Jesus doesn't know. We're tempted to think, what does he know? He did, went about on earth doing good, and now he's in heaven. But no, the reason he came was that he might experience all these different things that we go through. And that's one way in which he is made perfect, that he has that experience of being human. So when you think, Jesus doesn't know, that's wrong. Jesus does know. We're tempted to think that Jesus doesn't know, but he does know. And yet he is King Jesus. He came from the glory. He went back to the glory. He is able to affect these things. He's everything, isn't he? You see that? He had to come down to pay for our sin, and was pointed to this cross, remembering the value of the cross. Because Jesus became human, we regain Adam's lost dominion over the earth.
You will own and be happy.
That's right. I'll say that again, that's right. Because Jesus became human, we regain Adam's lost dominion over the earth. So what Adam lost, we will one day regain. Because Jesus became human, he was able to bring many sons to glory. And that's you and me, if we're saved, if we've become born again, as new creations, as we were singing earlier. Because Jesus became human, he's able to deliver us from death and the grip of Satan. And because Jesus became human, he is able to be our sympathetic high priest. In this book of Hebrews, I don't want this to be dry theology. I want this to be living. And I'm sure God does as well. A living book, something that affects our lives. And it shows us how Jesus is superior to anything or anybody else, superior to the angels, and yet he had to become lower than the angels for a season, for a little while, so that he might go through with the cross and know all that happens to us. So please, in all these things, in your temptations, think of King Jesus. But we see King Jesus. You and I, we need to see King Jesus in his glory.